The Trail of Tears is a story of profound loss and unimaginable suffering. In the 1830s, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole peoples thrived in their southeastern homelands, with farms, schools, and their own written language. Despite adopting many aspects of American culture, their efforts to coexist peacefully were ignored. The discovery of gold in Georgia and the expansion of cotton plantations fueled the U.S. government's demand for their land. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, gave the government power to force these nations from their homes. The Choctaw were the first to be relocated in 1831, a journey so devastating it was called a trail of tears and death. For the Cherokee, the tragedy began in 1838. Despite a Supreme Court ruling in their favor, President Van Buren ordered the army to round them up. Soldiers forced families from their homes at gunpoint, herding them into squalid stockades where disease spread rapidly. The march west was a 1,000-mile ordeal through brutal winter, starvation, and disease. Many died along the way, buried in unmarked graves, while survivors were forced to keep moving. This was not a migration, it was a death march, designed to break a proud nation. The Cherokee called it Nuna Daul Isunyi, the trail where they cried. Of the 16,000 Cherokee forced from their lands, at least 4,000 died. The Trail of Tears was not a tragic accident, but the direct result of a policy that valued land over indigenous lives. It remains one of the most shameful episodes in American history. The Trail of Tears was the result of a long-standing U.S. policy to displace indigenous peoples. From the nation's founding, the rhetoric of liberty clashed with a relentless hunger for land. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 formalized the government's intent to clear indigenous nations for white settlement. Proponents claimed removal was benevolent, but the real motive was economic gain. Indigenous nations were treated as obstacles, their rights and treaties ignored. Racist ideologies painted Native Americans as savages, justifying their removal. In reality, nations like the Cherokee had complex societies and governments. The cycle was clear: negotiate treaties, break them, use force, and open land to settlers. The Trail of Tears was not an anomaly, but a brutal expression of U.S. expansionism. When land and indigenous rights conflicted, the government chose land, again and again. This pattern shaped the nation's growth at a devastating cost. Before Europeans arrived, North America was home to millions, organized into hundreds of nations. These societies were diverse, with cities, trade, art, and complex governance. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy had a constitution that influenced American founders. The Mississippian cultures built cities like Cahokia, larger than London at the time. The myth of an empty wilderness was created to justify conquest, erasing indigenous stewardship. Native peoples actively managed the land, practiced advanced agriculture, and maintained deep spiritual connections to the earth. Europeans entered a continent of sovereign nations, not a vacuum. American history often begins with colonization, erasing millennia of civilization. Understanding this reality reframes U.S. history as the invasion of an ancient world. European arrival unleashed a demographic catastrophe for indigenous peoples. Disease, smallpox, measles, influenza, decimated populations, sometimes wiping out 90% in a century. Colonizers sometimes used disease as a weapon, as at Fort Pitt in 1763, where smallpox-infected blankets were distributed to indigenous nations. Violence and destruction of food sources, like the mass slaughter of buffalo, further devastated communities. By the 1880s, buffalo herds were nearly extinct, forcing Plains nations into starvation and submission. The indigenous population north of Mexico fell from over 10 million to less than 250,000 by the late 1800s. This was not a natural decline, but a sustained campaign of extermination and displacement. Forced removals like the Trail of Tears were part of a larger project to eliminate indigenous peoples as barriers to expansion. The continent was not settled, it was conquered. The cost was millions of lives and the destruction of entire nations. This legacy shapes America to this day. The U.S. used treaties as tools to acquire land, signing over 370 with indigenous nations. These agreements recognized indigenous sovereignty, on paper. In reality, treaties were broken whenever land became valuable. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 guaranteed the Lakota the Black Hills, but gold discoveries led to its violation. The government failed to stop illegal miners, then pressured the Lakota to cede their sacred land. When they refused, the U.S. launched military campaigns, ultimately seizing the Black Hills in 1877. This pattern repeated across the continent, treaties made, then broken for economic gain. In 1871, Congress ended treaty making, further eroding indigenous sovereignty. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled the Black Hills seizure illegal, awarding the Sioux financial compensation. The Sioux refused the money, insisting, "The Black Hills are not for sale." The demand for land back is a testament to the enduring power of these broken promises. Treaties were not honored, they were tools of dispossession. The consequences are still felt today. By the late 1800s, U.S. policy shifted from removal to forced assimilation. The Dawes Act of 1887 broke up communal lands, allotting small parcels to individuals and selling the rest to settlers. Indigenous landholdings plummeted from 138 million to 48 million acres. Boarding schools took children from their families, forbidding their languages and traditions. Conditions were harsh, with disease and abuse rampant. These policies shattered indigenous societies, creating poverty and intergenerational trauma. The goal was clear: erase indigenous identity and sovereignty. The Dawes Act and boarding schools worked together to destroy cultures and claim land. The legacy of this cultural genocide endures in Native communities today. The legacy of removal, genocide, and assimilation continues to harm indigenous communities. Poverty, health disparities, and social crises are direct results of federal policies. The epidemic of missing and murdered indigenous women and girls exposes ongoing violence and legal neglect. Protests like Standing Rock show the fight for land and water rights is far from over. Symbols like Mount Rushmore, carved into stolen sacred land, highlight unresolved conflicts. Figures like Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill reveal national amnesia about this history. Indigenous peoples were excluded from American democracy, denied citizenship and voting rights for decades. This history is not a footnote. It is central to the American story. Its consequences are felt every day in indigenous communities. Confronting this history is about national honesty, not assigning guilt. Healing requires facing the full truth, beyond sanitized myths. Justice for indigenous nations begins with land, restoring what was stolen and honoring treaties. This could mean returning sacred sites or granting co-management of federal lands. Honoring treaties means respecting sovereignty and protecting water and land rights. Justice also means amplifying indigenous voices in education, media, and government. Supporting indigenous-led movements for justice and self-determination is essential. The question of justice is for every American to consider. Should treaties be honored? Should land be returned? There are no easy answers, but the conversation must begin with truth. The Trail of Tears did not end in Oklahoma. It runs through all of American history. The path forward depends on what we choose to do now.